Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're beginning a series of lectures by Dr. Pinchas Roth. Dr. Roth this academic year is a Tikva scholar at New York University's Tikva Center. He received his PhD from the Department of Talmud and Halakhah at Hebrew U. His dissertation is titled Later Provincial Sages, Jewish Law and Rabbis in Southern France, 1215 to 1348. Received his BA in Talmud from Hebrew U and his MA in Medieval Jewish History from Yeshiva University. Alongside his academic studies, Dr. Roth has been working cataloging Hebrew manuscripts at important libraries in both Jerusalem and New York. The series of lectures is entitled Forgotten Paths of Halakhah, Explorations in Medieval Rabbinic Culture, and the lecture tonight specifically is titled Halakhah in Medieval Provence, between North and South, between Maimonides and the Tosafists. Dr. Roth.
I'd like to thank the rabbinic staff at the RJC and the community which has welcomed my family this year. Tonight and over the next 2 weeks, I want to talk about rabbinic culture and especially Halakhah in the Middle Ages. Halakhah expresses the idea of walking along a path. In a halachic community, walking along that path is often second nature. It's every bump and crack absorbed into the collective memory. But different people walk along different paths, even when they're walking to the same place. And different communities followed and developed halakhah in different ways, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. My goal is to speak about some of the forgotten pathways in a way that will hopefully enrich our understanding of where our halakhah comes from and how we continue to experience it. When we think of the variety of traditions within Judaism, we tend to divide Jews into either Ashkenazim or Sfaradim. Most of us realize that this is an oversimplification, since there are quite a number of communities that can't be subsumed under either of these headings. Yemenite Jews, Italians, Greeks, Bukharans, Syrians, not to mention Ethiopians. Each of these communities represents a hoary tradition dating back hundreds of years. But they're all quite small, and overall the Ashkenaz-Sfarad dichotomy works most of the time. This perception that Jews must be either Ashkenazim or Sfaradim also exerts pressure within those smaller communities, challenging and often eroding their unique identity. In the Middle Ages, when the world was not the global community it is today, many more communities maintained individuated rituals. Sometimes, those identities were snuffed out by expulsion or aggressive conversion campaigns. For example, the communities of southern Italy, with their ancient roots and their ties to the land of Israel, were effectively wiped out through conversion in the 13th century. The liturgy of northern France, home of Rashi and Marceau Vitry, faded away soon after the Jews were expelled from France in 1306. But often, it was internal social forces that made these sometimes subtle differences disappear. My focus tonight is on one of the Jewish communities which existed during the Middle Ages, proudly and self-consciously as neither Sephardic nor Ashkenazic. The Jews of southern France, who lived along the Mediterranean coast of modern France and on the banks of the Rhone River. That's the black line next to where it says Carpentras. In the areas known as Languedoc, which is to the...
Excuse me, we use the microphone.
Languedoc is on the left, and Provence is on the right, on either bank of the Rhone River. So this community produced generations of rabbis and scholars whose names live on among us today. But as a community, they disappeared completely almost 250 years ago in the wake of the French Revolution. Provence, which is the term I'll use for convenience when I mean Provence and Languedoc, is one of the lesser known Jewish communities of medieval Europe. But the Talmudic scholarship and halachic work achieved in that community had a lasting impact on the Jewish tradition. In fact, here in Riverdale, I feel embarrassed to even speak of Provence, since I see Rabbi William Herskowitz here, who wrote an important dissertation on one of the greats of 13th century Languedoc.
You have to speak loud and you have to speak into the microphone.
Why do you hold it loud?
Speak loud.
This is also the home of Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, who's contributed very significantly to our understanding of Halakhah in southern France. Scholars of the past half century have devoted their attentions to the giants of the 12th century Languedoc. Rabbi Avram ben Yitzchak Av Beit Din of Narbonne, author of Sefer Eshkol, Rabbi Avram ben David of Poskier, better known as the Ravad, and Rabbi Ezrachia ben Yitzchak Halevi, the Baal HaMa'or. The 12th century was a momentous period. Medieval historians speak of a 12th century renaissance in Western Europe. And in rabbinic history, it saw the rise of two brilliant minds who revolutionized our approach to Halakhah, but were never aware of each other. The Rambam in Egypt and Rabbeinu Tam in northern France. The rabbis of southern France had the almost unique distinction of corresponding with both of these figures during their lifetimes. And their combined impact would resonate in Provence long after their deaths. Rabbi Ezrachia Halevi was one of the first people to incorporate Rabbeinu Tam's new readings of the Talmud into his commentarial work, Sefer HaMa'or. And Ravad was one of the first to read and comment on Rambam's Mishneh Torah, leading to his famous Hasagot, or glosses, many of which were simply reader's notes, expressing not only disapproval, but also confusion and sometimes simply noting which Talmudic source had led Maimonides to his conclusion. Rabbi Yonatan of Lunel, a younger contemporary of Ravad, corresponded directly with Rambam, sending him a series of questions on Mishneh Torah, many of which were based on Ravad's critiques. Rambam's response was a long time coming, but when it finally did, it provided answers to Ravad's questions. Answers which probably provided the basis for Rabbi Yonatan's rebuttal of Ravad's attacks. At the same time, philosophy began to play a crucial role in Jewish culture in southern France. The Ibn Tibon family, which arrived in Lunel in the 12th century from Granada, began a multi-generational project of translating works of science and philosophy from Arabic into Hebrew. Shmuel, Samuel ibn Tibon, translated Rambam's Guide of the Perplexed into Hebrew and unleashed a huge wave of interest in rational philosophy. This cultural revolution was not without its discontents. The story of Jewish philosophy and science in southern France, and the controversies that accompanied it, has drawn a great deal of interest among scholars and historians, and has helped to paint a picture of this Jewish community as one where Torah learning and Halakhah did not play a major role. My own research, over the course of writing my dissertation in Jerusalem, focused on Halakhah and rabbis in southern France during the 13th and 14th centuries, after the 12th century that I was speaking about, a period that is usually considered downtime, as rabbis tried to sum up, assimilate, and systematize the breakthroughs of the previous century. What I'd like to share with you tonight are some of the halachic debates that erupted in southern France during this later period. Debates which I believe can help us identify some of the characteristics of this period as one that was highly creative and fascinating. First, I want to discuss two related debates about marriage law, and then something about kosher wine. Then, moving from topics to people, I will speak about some of the personal conflicts that erupted in southern France during this period, ending with one of the most argumentative rabbis in medieval history. The first debate erupted over what is known as Kiddushei Schok, marriage made in jest. This particular event took place in Toulouse, probably around the year 1270. A group of young men were dining at an inn, and a young woman, Chana, joined them. They ate until there was no food left, and Chana asked one of the men to give her money to buy fruit. Reaching into his pocket, the man pulled out a gold coin, more than enough to pay for the fruit. Chana asked to see the coin, and when he passed it to her, the young man made the declaration, "This coin is given to you for the sake of kiddushin, for marriage." Then he turned to his friends and he said, "You are my witnesses." Chana said nothing, and afterwards claimed that she hadn't understood what was going on. So the question was whether she was considered married to this man or not. There are two basic ways to approach this question, which arises with regularity in every generation, I'm told. One approach is to ascertain what exactly transpired. Which words did the man use? What kind of object did he give to the woman? Who else was there? In order to determine whether the formal requirements of Kiddushin were met. The other approach focuses on the intentions of both parties, asking whether they both intended to contract a marriage. For the second approach, the context in which the events took place is important, since it can provide clues regarding the internal thoughts of the man and the woman. For the first approach, what I'm calling the formal approach, It's concerned with the actions that took place and the words that were said, and it doesn't really matter what the backdrop was. In this specific case from Toulouse, the local rabbi composed a lengthy responsum, what we know as shut, sheila tshuva, to support his position that the marriage was not binding. First, he analyzed the language allegedly used by the young man in the pub and found that it was lacking some formal components, since the man never specified that the woman should be married to him. In the course of his discussion, the rabbi related to the complex Talmudic topic of Yadot Nidarim, and he invoked the names of Rashi, Rashi's son-in-law Rabbi Meir, three of Rabbi Meir's sons, Rashi's grandsons, Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Natan, Rabbi Shmuel, the Rashbam, and Rabbi Yitzchak, and their great-nephew, Rabbi Elchanan ben Yitzchak. So that's 6 members of Rashi's family in one shuvah. All these were mentioned in the course of his discussion of the language used. And then in one short paragraph, he took what I called before the second approach. He stated categorically that any kiddushay schok, any marriage contracted in an atmosphere of levity and joking, is invalid even if the most accurate terminology was used. To back up this statement, he quoted from Ra'avad, the famous sage of 12th century Languedoc, who himself had disqualified such a marriage because the woman thought it was a joke. The rabbi of Toulouse sent his responsum about this case to nearby Narbonne and to distant northern France. Maybe I'll, so you can see on the map. I added in Narbonne, Toulouse was already there, and Paris is way up in the north, where it was received by Rabbi Yitzchak of Corbeil, author of the famous Sefer Mitzvot Katan, or Smak. He and the 2 other members of his court responded vigorously. They all vehemently opposed the contextual approach, going so far as to say that Ravad's position was false, a mistake caused by ignorant scribes. Focusing instead only on the terminology issue, they each concluded that there was at least a possibility that it was valid, and so the young woman required a divorce in order to be free to marry someone else. Besides the 3 members of this northern court, an additional rabbi took a stringent position. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Yitzchak Kino, from Chinon in central France in the Loire Valley, which is, if you look on the map, on the left side, right where the green moves into the pink at the top. The 2 rabbis from southern France, who both sat on the court in Narbonne, were Rabbi Mordechai Kimchi and Rabbi David ben Levi. David ben Levi is still known today for his work Sefer HaMichtam, and though Rabbi Mordechai Kimchi is almost forgotten, he was a grandson of the very famous commentator Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi. They both wrote lenient responses, supporting the Toulouse rabbi in his position that the woman Chana did not need a divorce. They concurred with the Toulouse rabbi on all points, but they provided particularly strong support for his position on the importance of context in cases of kiddushay schok. Rabbi Kimchi introduced a passage by Rav Hai Gaon. Actually, his name should be pronounced Haye, rhyming with Abaye, who was the last great Gaon of Babylonia, died in 1038. Rav Hai had said that his grandfather...
Just gonna free this up. If you want to go point to it. Here, you're fine.
Okay. Rav Hai described a takana, a communal decree by his own grandfather, to the effect that any kiddushin contracted without a proper ceremony, that is, a ketubah signed by witnesses and recitation of the brachot, any wedding that didn't include those components would be invalidated by the rabbis, what we call afkeinu rabbanan the kiddushin. Similarly, Rabbi David, the author of the Michtam, claimed that any kiddushin made without shidduchim, in other words, without some preliminary negotiation and agreement, was invalid. So for them, the context was crucial, and it didn't matter whether all of the formal components were there. The neat divide on this question between northern and southern rabbis is striking. All of the rabbis who responded from northern France took a stringent position, and all the southern rabbis endorsed the lenient position of the Toulouse rabbi. And this particular divide between north and south seems to have had much deeper roots. It seems to be an issue on which rabbinic decisors from northern Europe differ from rabbis in the Mediterranean throughout history. To take a reckless jump forward, an issue came before the chief rabbinate in the British Mandate of Palestine in the 1920s, or 30s, 20s. In order to receive a certificate allowing her to make Aliyah, a woman in Turkey married a man from the same community who had already received his certificate. Though they had a formal wedding in Istanbul, everyone involved, including the rabbi who officiated, understood that it was all a facade. And as soon as they reached the land of Israel, the man and woman parted ways. Some years later, though, someone brought the story to the attention of the chief rabbinate, which then deliberated whether the woman needed a divorce. Rav Uziel, the Sephardi chief rabbi, argued that a wedding such as this was obviously invalid, since all the parties knew they were involved in a scam. But Rav Kook pointed to the formal elements of the wedding, which had all been performed properly, and therefore refused to let her go without a get. Looking back at the first stage in the Toulouse debate, it's interesting to think one more time about how the local rabbi built his argument. He could simply have said that there was no marriage because it happened in a pub and the woman thought it was a joke. He could also have sent the decision to the rabbis in Narbonne and they would have backed him up. But he chose to send his letter in addition to the north, to the Baalei Tosafot. He knew they wouldn't be convinced by his argument from context. And perhaps he was also afraid that they would dismiss his learned analysis of the terminology issue. So he sent them a custom-made letter quoting more members of the family of Rashi than I think appear in any other single source. His need to use that kind of strategy, in fact, his need to send the tshuva so far away at all, is a reflection of the very high prestige given to the northern French rabbis, the Baalei Tosafot, even outside their own communities. The rabbi of Toulouse felt that in order for his halachic decision to find support in the wider community, he needed to convince the rabbis of Paris. Despite his efforts, he failed. The story of Hannah and the guys in the pub is very similar to another story, which took place at the beginning of the 14th century in Carpentras in the east. You can see it on the map. Can you see? Carpentras. So Toulouse is over here. Now we're way over here, in the white part, which didn't belong to France at this point. I'll get to that later. So we're in Carpentras. A group of men entered a public house where they ate and drank in the company of a woman until one of the men gave the woman a coin and said it was a token of marriage. So far, exactly the same as the first time. The difference was that this time, the house was a brothel and the woman was a prostitute. Nevertheless, a heated discussion erupted among the people gathered there. Some said the woman and her client were now married, while others, including the woman herself, declared that it was meant in jest, and therefore the kiddushin were invalid. After this discussion, the couple headed off into a private room. Now, it should be clear that the woman here was Jewish. And it seems likely that the establishment catered to Jews, serving them kosher food. Brothels were tolerated in Provence, and some of them were even publicly owned. And the dining room was one of their essential features, since prostitutes were not supposed to eat off the premises. So the crowd was not only Jewish, but apparently had a fair understanding of Jewish marriage laws. And they raised precisely the sides of the argument that had raged among the rabbis in the Toulouse case. Do we focus on the formal actions and words used, or on the context? Are they married or not? In this case, the question was not forwarded to the Baalei Tosafot in northern France, because that group no longer existed. The Jews had been expelled from the Kingdom of France in 1306. And this case occurred a few years after that traumatic event. Instead, the local judge sent the question to two rabbis who lived in Provence. Rabbi Abba Mari ben Moshe of Arles may be familiar to some of you as the instigator of the allegory controversy, which riled Jewish society in southern France in 1304-1305, which was studied deeply by Dr. Greg Stern, who's now a member of the Hashkama Minyan here. The other rabbi was named Yitzchak Kimchi, and he was the son of Rabbi Mordechai Kimchi, one of the judges of Narbonne, whom I mentioned before. They both gave similar answers. The language used for the kiddushin was not good enough, but anyway, the context made it obvious that it was not a valid marriage. This story from Carpentras shows us that the halachic approach of the southern French rabbis remained steady throughout the period, despite the strongly dissenting opinion of the Baalei Tosafot. It also shows the complicated place that Halakhah held in Jewish society at the time. On the one hand, these bands of young men and women sound like trouble. All the proof that any preacher would need that the generation was going down the drain. They hang out in pubs, they flaunt the guidelines of modesty, they throw their money around on booze, and so on. On the other hand, the people they mingled with were apparently exclusively Jewish. They were all familiar with the guidelines of Halakhah, including the prostitute. And they cared enough about Halakhah to discuss the question of whether they had contracted a marriage according to Halakhah. The Jews of southern France are sometimes portrayed as being less serious, less Jewishly committed than their brethren in the north. The northerners, according to this stereotype, were all Torah scholars and saints who followed the Halakhah no matter how difficult it was. And the southerners, the Jews of Provence and Spain, were assimilated philosophers who led self-indulgent lives unburdened by the heavy yoke of Halakhah. Part of my point here is that things were much more complicated than that. Sometimes the difference between north and south reflected two different approaches to Halakhah. And sometimes we might even say that the southerners were even more committed to Halakhah than the northerners were. One example of their real commitment to Halakhah can be drawn from the topic of Yain Nesech, or the laws of kosher wine. Professor Chaim Soloveitchik has written extensively on this topic, showing how important wine was for the Jews of Northern Europe, and how the rabbis of their communities made an ongoing effort to present halachic decisions that struck a balance between halachic sources and the abilities of the community. Now, in Muslim countries, the reality was quite different. For one, it's much easier to grow grapes around the Mediterranean than it is in Northern Europe. Also, Muslims are not supposed to drink alcohol. So the problem of obtaining kosher wine and keeping it kosher was less acute in places like Egypt or Spain than it was in France or Germany. Because of this, many of the special halachic solutions devised by the Baalei HaTosafot were never really taken on in other areas. On the other hand, Jews in Muslim lands also lacked the visceral reaction of fear and repugnance from non-kosher wine. The Jews in the north felt what Professor Soloveitchik has called their ritual instinct. So the Jews of southern France make an interesting case, since they were living in a Mediterranean land that was ruled by Christians. So on the one hand, they could grow plenty of grapes, but on the other, they were surrounded by people who were drinking wine as well and were not Jewish. They were well aware of the developments among the Tosafists in the north, and their response was mixed. I'll speak about one example. According to the Baalei HaTosafot, grapes can be crushed by non-Jews, and they're not considered wine, and therefore not non-kosher wine, until the grape skins have been filtered out of the juice. Although some rabbis felt uncomfortable with this, the strong custom was therefore to buy filled vats of pressed grapes from non-Jews, so that the Jews needed to take over the work only from the moment when the juice was poured out and the process of fermentation began. This custom of northern France arrived in southern France towards the end of the 12th century. Until then, it had been considered obviously forbidden to buy pressed grapes from non-Jews. In some places, though, the new custom began to catch on. One of the most interesting halachic books from southern France in this period, maybe one of the most interesting halachic books at all, is Sheilot Tshuvot Min HaShamayim, Questions and Answers from Heaven. It contains questions that Rabbi Yaakov ben Levi asked in his sleep from the angels in heaven, and the answers that he received. So he asked about this new custom of buying pressed grapes in their containers from non-Jews. And he was told, there's nothing wrong with it. Ein bazeh shum nidnud avera. But then the angels went on to tell him that he should continue to follow the old custom and not disdain his mother because she's old. Al tavoz ki zakna imecha. In fact, they continued, anyone who is stringent in this will be blessed, and those who are lenient will find that God is lenient in protecting their lives. Something of a mixed message, and typical of what might happen to you when you get an answer in your dream. What's fascinating about this particular issue of buying or not buying pressed grapes from non-Jews is that there are many surviving documents that can actually tell us what happened. Thousands of documents of all kinds from medieval Provence and Languedoc still exist today. And historians have studied them from many perspectives. And although they contain many records of wine sales, and there are many records of Jews buying things, there are virtually no records of Jews buying pressed grapes from non-Jews. Jews would either grow the grapes themselves, or buy them unpressed from the non-Jews as whole grapes, like we buy in the store, in the supermarket, or or buy them pressed from only Jews. Now this reality is so striking as it arises from the documents. The one historian who was studying them wondered why they couldn't have bought the pressed grapes from non-Jews like everybody else did. And she looked it up in a book, and she found that, according to Halakhah, you're allowed to do that. And she had no answer. Why the Jews in southern France were so insistent about avoiding this very convenient ruling. So she was correct that Halakhah says that you can buy pressed grapes, but that's the Halakhah of the Tosafists. That's the Halakhah of northern France. In southern France, that Halakhah had never caught on. In southern France, rabbis and common Jews alike resisted the innovations of Rabbeinu Tam in the area of wine and maintained quite a high level of communal supervision over kashrut standards in wine. One reason why the Jews of southern France were able to maintain this more stringent approach was because grapes are so much more widespread than in the south, and many Jews owned their own vineyards. Another reason, though, is that they were really suspicious of new ideas coming from the north. Ideas weren't the only thing coming from the north of France to the south. People were too. Over the course of the 13th century, the French kingdom came to control virtually the entire region of Languedoc, and its influence also grew in neighboring areas like Provence. During the reign of St. Louis, which was from 1226 to 1270, through most of the 13th century, things became more and more difficult for Jews in the French kingdom. This is Louis IX, and he earned his title of saint by being very serious about his religion. That included a vigorous campaign against Jewish moneylenders. And since almost all Jews were moneylenders, that wasn't good news for the Jews. In 1240, King Louis ordered a trial to investigate the Talmud, and in 1242, in the wake of the trial, the Talmud was burned in Paris. The Jews in England had been suffering even more, and in 1290 they were all expelled. 16 years later, in 1306, France followed England's example and expelled all the Jews from its land. What all this meant was that there were good reasons for Jews to leave northern France, and many of them found their way south to the county of Provence. Just more or less there. So many of them came that they created French enclaves within the Provençal communities. There they had their own rabbis, their own yeshivot, and followed their own customs. Unsurprisingly, this caused tension with the local Provençal Jews. When Clonimus ben Clonimus, who was a famous translator and scientist, described all the yeshivot in Provence, which was all in order to explain to his wife why he had no choice but to leave her and move to Spain, he described one yeshiva in the town of Manosque as being French and therefore not a good place for him. Another example of the tension between the French and the Provençal Jews comes from a question that was sent to Rabbi Yitzchak Kimchi. The question was, why do the French Jews refuse to buy bread from us, from the Provençal Jews, and instead they buy the bread from non-Jews? What? Our bread is less kosher than the goyim? So Rabbi Kimchi explained that it was because of two conflicting opinions about how to take challah from the bread. Do you take it from the yeast, or do you leave the yeast without taking challah and only take from the finished product? So his response was very level-headed and fair. But the question hints that other Provençal Jews were quite offended by the psak of the French rabbis, which declared their bread less kosher than the bread of goyim. Giving a psak like that requires a fair amount of chutzpah, or a lack of respect for the local community. Earlier, when I was talking about Rabbi Yitzchak of Corbeil, in the wet marriage ceremony in the pub in Toulouse, I suggested that the Balei Tosafot of the north didn't respect the rabbis of the south. I think the Jewish refugees who moved to Provence carried that attitude with them, that lack of respect for the Jews of southern France. Perhaps because their rabbinic scholars were not so well known. Perhaps because they spoke a different language. Perhaps simply because the French Jews were newcomers and almost refugees. They expressed their hesitation as aggression. Within the expatriate community of French Jews in Provence, and in the yeshiva of Manosque that Clonimus mentioned, we find the figure of Rabbi Yitzchak HaKohen of Manosque. Rabbi Yitzchak appears in many Latin documents from Manosque as the rabbi of the town. He also appears in Hebrew sources. He first crops up as a fairly young man who got into a fight with his teacher, Rabbi Baruch of Din, So Din is over here, and Manosk is a little further south. Rabbi Baruch, for reasons we'll probably never know, called Rabbi Yitzchak an idiot, an ignoramus, and a wicked sinner. Rabbi Yitzchak shouted back that if he was an ignoramus, it wasn't because he was absent from the yeshiva, gallivanting off to Rome like some other lazy people he could name, i.e. Rabbi Baruch. As punishment for this outburst, Rabbi Baruch placed Rabbi Yitzchak under ban, nidui. Rabbi Yitzchak tried to apologize, but instead Rabbi Baruch turned to the rabbis of northern France, to the Balei Tosafot, and asked them to add their own ban, their own nidui, against his student. Rebuffed and stung, Rabbi Yitzchak turned to his neighbors, the Provençal rabbis of Carpentras and Avignon. Even though he himself was from the north, the Provençal rabbis took his side and berated the French rabbis from the north for getting involved in a fight far from their homes and for banning someone without ever seeing him. Several decades later, a very similar case erupted in the same place in Manosk. A student from the yeshiva traveled to another town and told the rabbi there slanderous stories about his teacher in Manosk. And when the Rosh Yeshiva of Manosk heard about this, he placed his student in nidui. The rabbi in the other town, who was also from northern France, rejected the nidui. So the rabbi of Manosk turned to Avignon and Arles for support from the rabbis there. From their responses, it became clear that the rabbi of Manosk, the one who had placed his student under nidui, was none other than Rabbi Yitzchak of Manosk. His early experiences with his own teacher had not taught him the value of compromise. On the contrary, he had adopted the tactics of Rabbi Baruch, using the tool of nidui to punish his own student, as he himself had suffered in his youth. Like in his tactics, Rabbi Yitzchak of Manosk remained consistent in his choice of allies. His student, like his teacher, tried to draw support from the French rabbis, while he himself turned to the local Provençal rabbis. Not that he necessarily enjoyed such warm relations with them either. We have a letter sent by Rabbi Yitzchak Kimchi to his friend, the famous Ralbag, Rabbi Levi ben Gershom, in which they share their frustration over Rabbi Yitzchak of Manosk. They're arguing over a divorce case. But even though Rabbi Kimchi agreed that this rabbi of Manosk was wrong, his advice to Ralbag was to avoid an open fight. Rabbi Yitzchak HaKohen of Manosk seems to be the kind of public figure who just rolls from one fight to another. The tensions in Provence between Jews from northern France and the local Provençal Jews continued over the course of the 14th century. But as a living, active group, the Balei Tosafot disappeared when the Jews were expelled from France in 1306. Some Jews returned to Paris and other places when the expulsion was rescinded in 1315. But the French yeshiva never returned to the heights they had achieved in the 13th century. In the south, however, the Jews continued to live in Provence, and we even have several halachic works that were written during the 14th century. However, the Provençal Jews were becoming increasingly isolated from the rest of the Jewish world. In 1348, they suffered terribly from the Black Death and from the fierce attacks on Jews that came in its wake. In 1492, the Jews of Spain were expelled, leaving Provence even more isolated. And in 1501, the county of Provence was officially given over to the King of France. And as part of this political transition, the Jews were expelled. The only remaining Jewish communities in Provence, indeed virtually in all of Western Europe, were those in the area called Comtat Venaissin, a region including Carpentras and Avignon, which belonged directly to the Catholic Pope. These communities remained in place, confined to ghettos, for almost 3 centuries, until the French Revolution brought the Comtat back to French rule and began the process of emancipation for those few Jews who remained within French borders. And afterwards also to the Jews of Alsace, but that's a different story. Emancipation allowed the Jews out of the ghetto and quite soon out of the community, and at the dawn of modernity, this medieval community faded away. So till today you can see the synagogue in Carpentras. I think that this version of it was built in the 17th century, but as an actual community of Jews from Provence, they've disappeared by now. The Jews who live there now are immigrants from North Africa. All the Jews who had remained within the ghetto all through the Middle Ages, as soon as the ghetto was opened, they spread out into French society and disappeared. Halakhah in Provence developed in the shadow of major influences from north and from south. It grappled with a population that was deeply committed to Halakhah in some ways, but in others didn't exactly quake before the authority of local rabbis. Halakhah was a language for communal unity and for communal controversy, and it was a central aspect of Jewish community, of Jewish identity. Sorry, thank you.
Any questions?
Sure.
Just a simple clarifying question. Did the South, with their more lax interpretation of Halakhah, were influenced at all by the Sephardim in Spain?
You think the Sephardim in Spain were also lax?
No, like typically, I don't know. What I've seen, if there's a machloket in Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah often comes out in the Machmir side, leaving the Shulchan Aruch on the more Makil side of the argument. So I just was curious in your thoughts on that.
Well, this predates the Shulchan Aruch.
Sure.
But I would say that their baseline of Halakhah was Rambam's Mishneh Torah. So it's not quite Spain, but it's what you might identify as the Sephardi tradition.
What was the political government of Provence?
It's not an easy question, but for most of the period that we're talking about, it was a county which officially belonged to the empire, to the Holy Roman Emperor. But for the last few decades of the 13th century, the Count of Provence was Charles of Anjou, who was the brother of the King of France. So even though it was technically independent, or maybe not technically independent, the connection to France was very strong.
Did they have their own language in Provence?
Yes, I mean there are a number of dialects, but in general there's something that's called either Provençal or Occitan that's spoken all across the south.
Is this a French dialect?
No, it's most closely related to Catalan. It's a Romance language. Till today there are people who speak Occitan in the south of France, and there's something of a separatist movement there, people who think that the south of France should once again be independent. And during those long years when the Jews were confined to the ghettos in Comtat-Venaissin, they developed what's known as Judeo-Provençal, which is a Jewish language, kind of like Yiddish or Ladino, that incorporated Hebrew and Provençal together.
Could you talk about what happened to the major Chachamim in Narbonne? This was an old center, and yet it seems to dissipate when you get into the 13th century.
The answer is here. Everything in green belonged to France by the middle of the 13th century, and that includes Narbonne. So in 1306, when the Jews were expelled from France, they were expelled from Narbonne.
But prior to that?
Prior to that, I think the community was still quite active.
Yeah.
There was a movement east to Provence. Rabbi Mordechai Kimchi, whom I mentioned, he moved before the expulsion from Narbonne to Carpentras. But other people like the Michtam, I'm forgetting, there are a whole number of Chachamim who were there until the end. We don't know what happened to them after the expulsion, but they seem to have been there till the beginning of the 14th century.
So, did the Ravid and the Balamor get involved with the marriage problem? I mean, they would have been consulted.
It was after their time. The Ravad died in 1198.
The story in the pub. When,
Yeah, that's...
what was the,
I think that's around 1270.
oh, so that's much later. Okay.
Yeah. It would have been nice.
Would you say that there weren't very many major rabbinic decisors in Provence as opposed to the northern part of France?
I wouldn't. but I might be biased.
Repeat the question. What the question?
Were there fewer prominent rabbis in southern France than there were in northern France? Right? That's the question. I think that in the second half of the 13th century, there aren't that many major figures to begin with. If you think of the major figures we have in northern France during that time, the only ones who come to mind for the closing decades of the 13th century are the Smak, Rabbi Yitzchak of Corbeil, and Rabbi Peretz of Corbeil, who was his younger contemporary, lived in the same town. They're the only figures who really stand out. And even from them, besides the very specific works, we don't have much. We have, I think I once tried to count, I found maybe 5 tshuvot written by Rabbeinu Peretz. Part of the issue is that during those same decades, there were 2 real international poskim on a scale that I don't think had been seen ever before. One of them was the Maharam of Rottenburg in Germany, and the other was the Rashba in Barcelona. Now the rabbis in southern France, in Provence, were very close with the Rashba. They sent in questions all the time. And I think that they were quite willing to see themselves as being below him. But beyond that, they considered themselves quite competent at dealing with their own community.
Where does the Meiri fit into this mosaic?
Meiri lived here, in Perpignan, which, this area is called Roussillon. And at the period that I'm talking about, it didn't belong to France, and it didn't belong to Languedoc or Provence. It belonged to the Kingdom of Majorca, which ultimately belonged to Spain. Now, the Meiri considered himself part of Provence. He considered himself a descendant of people of Narbonne. But he didn't correspond with any of the rabbis that I'm talking about from Languedoc and Provence. The only people he was speaking to were the Rashba and people in that orbit. So I'm inclined not to consider him part of what I'm calling southern France.
Where are all these rabbinic documents found, and how long have they been available to researchers?
For Halakhah, there are 2 main manuscripts. One's in Oxford and the other is in Paris. The Oxford manuscript was published in 1967, and the Paris manuscript still hasn't been published. Somebody wrote a long article about it in 1901, and that's pretty much where things stand.
The manuscripts of what?
Of Tshuvot.
Where were they found before they reached the city?
The Paris manuscript was bought from somebody who lived in Bombay. How it got to Bombay, I imagine before that it was in Iraq, because that's where most of the Jews in Bombay came from. But before that, I haven't the slightest idea. The manuscript itself was copied in Provence in the 15th century. The Oxford manuscript, from what I remember, is in Spanish script from around the same time, around 1500. And I don't really know what happened to it in the intervening years, but there was one copy of that work that was making the rounds in the yeshivot of 16th century Saloniki. So people like the Shita Mekubetzet and his crowd had access to this material.
So, just before the expulsion from France, how did what do you have about the statistics of the Jewish communities in the north and the south? Were they about equal, or the French in the north were much more numerous?
No, the Jews in the south were more numerous. In general, the Jewish communities around the Mediterranean were always larger than the Jewish communities in Northern Europe. On the whole, yeah.
Although really part of northern France would include part of Ashkenaz also, right? It's hard to make it.
It depends on what kind of distinction you're making. But demographically, I think they were pretty much the same.
We tend to incorrectly include Languedoc with Provence. So we always talk about Provence. What were the differences between the two?
Well, the main difference from our perspective is that the older communities, the ones which produced well-known Talmidei Chachamim with lasting renown, were in Languedoc. In Narbonne, not so much in Toulouse, but places like Lunel and Montpellier. they're all in Languedoc. So almost all the people that you could name in the 12th century, the Baal HaEshkol, the Ravid, the Baal HaMaor, they're all living in Languedoc. The only one who lived in Provence was the Itur. He lived in Marseille. Over the course of the 13th century, and of course much more in the 14th century, after the expulsion, many small new Jewish communities were established in Provence. But if you're looking further back in history, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, and even before, back to Roman times, you have a Jewish presence in Narbonne, in other places in Languedoc, and only in one or two places in Provence, in basically Marseille and Arles, are the oldest communities there.
So I hate to ask you, why do we always make that mistake?
Well, one reason is that the Romans called the whole area Provincia, and there isn't really any good name for the whole area. Greg Stern in his book quotes somebody at the beginning who just calls it the area that takes 3 days to walk across. So,
Are you talking about the Spanish expulsion?
not really. I hope one day to learn more about that, about the Spanish expulsion of 1492. I'm still kind of working on the 13th, 14th century. When I get to the 15th century, I hope I'll have something to say about that too.
So maybe just to pick your brain, I mean, given the communications between the Jews in Provence and the Tsarfatim in the central area, I've always been perplexed by the communications within that community. You know, when it comes to, let's say, a later figure such as the Rambam, he's totally unaware of the French community and doesn't seem to know about their existence. Wouldn't one have expected that some amount of community, or what is your thinking about that?
So one problem is, when you look at documents from the Geniza that refer to Jews from Christian Europe, they're all given the same name, Al-Rum, after Rome. In other words, the Jews of Christian Europe. Jews in Egypt weren't differentiating between southern France and northern France, or even between France and Byzantium. It was all one big blur for them. It was, all those people beyond the edge of civilization. Also, I think that the very fact that the Rambam knew about the rabbis in Lunel was only because they wrote to him. They took the initiative.
And they also were in community with some people who were in Egypt as well, too. Poets, or had other associations there.
Right. Well, there seem to have been people, rabbis or judges in Egypt at the time of the Rambam who originated in southern France, like Anatoly.
Anatoly, definitely.
So is the question why they didn't take it upon themselves to tell the Rambam about Rebbe and Tam?
Some of the communication, I mean, when he refers to it in his letter to the Chachmei Lunel, and he talks about the communities that are there in the world who are B'nai Torah, and he imposes upon them the mantle of Torah, and he reviews what he knows of learned Jewry. He does not mention anything beyond the Jews in the south. And he doesn't make any reference of others with whom they had been in communication, those in the south had been in communication in the north.
Well, I think it's just that they hadn't told him, and he didn't have a reason to be aware of it. Shama Friedman recently suggested that Rambam became aware of Rashi's commentary.
Yeah, I think it's not very...
Okay. So the default position is the Rambam had never heard of Rashi. He didn't know anything about Rashi, and he definitely didn't know anything about Rabbeinu Tam.
Yeah.
Now all that changed a few years later. Rambam's son, Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, met face to face with people who were coming from the north of France. He read Rashi's works and incorporated them into his own writings. He was very much aware of what was going on. The Rambam just wasn't. Okay, yeah, and then...
When the Jews were expelled from France, did they leave en masse, or where did they go?
First of all, the expulsion was very carefully planned, so the Jews would have no idea it was coming. The orders were sent out secretly, and most people didn't know that there was going to be an expulsion until the day it was declared. The French king did that in order to make sure that he caught all of their possessions as they were before they had time to get rid of them. So what did they... Wait, remind me the question was.
Where did they go?
Where did they go? They went, some of them went to Germany, some of them went to Provence, some of them went to Spain, some of them, I think... oh, yeah, of course, yeah. They went to northern Italy. There's a very major concentration of them there. They're scattered all over the place. Yeah.
The Bali Tosafists that we see, you know, like in the Gemara, those were the northern rabbis. So, since a lot of their works were burned in that Paris burning, etc., and how come we don't see more Tosafists from the southern part? I mean, did they do any writing, or they were the only ones who wrote down things like that?
No, the Jews in southern France were writing a lot. Maybe even more in some ways. They were kind of long-winded.
Why don't we see more of what we call Tosafists coming from that area rather than...
They were children of Russia. Children of Russia.
Well,
those were the Tosafot, the Hidushim of the Rashba, the Ramban, the Vidvar.
And
that's the comparable, the rival.
No, I don't think that that's really so true. It is striking that even though both the communities were expelled, the heritage of northern France was preserved fairly well, whereas the heritage of southern France was almost completely forgotten. I can put it to you in a slightly different way. All right, it's complicated, but there aren't very many manuscripts of Tosafot on the Gemara. There are quite a few Masechtot for which we have no manuscripts at all, and the only evidence we have is the first printing. And for the first printings, we have the testimony of the printer, who said that he traveled to various places, especially to northern Italy, where, as I just mentioned, there was a real concentration of French exiles, and that was where he found these manuscripts, and he copied them in order to produce the Tosfot al-Adaf. But we don't have a very wide range of manuscripts for that. What happens in southern France is we also don't have a lot of manuscripts of their halachic writings, but what you do have is a high incidence of autographs. An autograph is a manuscript that was written by the author himself. The page that we have before us is the page that the author wrote, or authorized copies. Somebody else wrote it for him and he went over it and made corrections in his own hand. Now, in general, autographs of rabbis are extremely rare. And for the Tosafot, I'm aware of one, and it's one page. But from southern France, there are quite a number of those, including Sefer Meorot by Rabbi Meir Hami'ili. We have his authorized copy. The manuscript was copied by someone else, and he went over it and made corrections and additions. Now, I've been asking myself for a while why we have so many of them dafka from southern France. One part of the answer is that there was no follow-up. Those were the only copies that were ever made. There was no continual reading audience like there has been for the Tosfot. Now, why is that? Maybe people didn't like the style. Or maybe it was just that the community was so uprooted by what it went through that it forgot about its own heritage.
Any other questions? We'd like to thank Dr. Roth for his time, and we look forward to the next 2 lectures.
Thank you.